Welcome back, everyone. This is episode 2. So thank you for joining us back on this journey. Hi, Mr. E. How are you going today?
Very well, thank you for IS. How are you?
I'm going pretty good. And if you're new here, this is the Revolutionary Think Tank podcast, where we talk everything political commentary, protest music, and revolutionary thinking.
Oh, yeah. And we've got quite the agenda today, right on point with the revolutionary think tank. Isn't that right for IS? We're going straight to the big question that I think a lot of people are probably wondering to themselves. And they've probably asked themselves based on some of the other content that they've seen of ours, what is a revolution? Big topic.
Yes, because I definitely think that it's definitely with your videos, you reference revolutionary times all the time. So I'd imagine people are always asking, what is a revolution?
Yes, I look, yes, like you said, it's a central feature to the content that I create and just my general purpose here in the 21st century. I always have my little taglines, there's much to do, much to learn, much to unlock before we can achieve the revolution. But like, what is that? What is achieving a revolution? What is unlocking a revolution? What is starting a movement that will lead to revolution? If you go right back, okay, so let's go on a little trip back in time here. The word revolution, obviously, a lot of people know it has this kind of double meaning to it. And like we separate in this day and age the two meanings. So revolution, we all know, is kind of making a circular movement, like how the earth revolves around the sun. That's completion of a revolution, is when you start in one point and you come full way around the circle and back again. That's the revolution. And it seems to be quite different from the term of revolution that we're using, which is, being revolutionary or having some type of revolutionary change in society. Now, it's funny though, if you look at the derivation of the word like revolution that we're talking about, the political, the social revolution, that does have its derivations from the exact same idea, the word that's been taken from astronomy. Revolution was basically a social form and an intention prior to the revolution, like the American Revolution, or the War of Independence and the French Revolution. It was grounded in this idea of actually returning back to a same starting point or a point of origin that had been lost. Now, in both the American sense and the French sense, there was both this feeling of the upper classes, so I guess you would say the aristocracy, maybe even the wealthy commoners, that they had lost power to the centralizing force of kings. So like back in the day before we modernized the world, before we liberalized the world and had democracy, there were monarchs and kings, queens ruled the world, all that sort of stuff. And they started to centralize their power. Before it was much more broken up. Yes, there was a king who ruled the kingdom, but they really left their aristocrats, their nobles, to control their own affairs. And it was only when a king needed something like an army or they needed to raise some special levy or tax that they came in and they drew upon their nobles, their aristocrats, to do things. That started to change towards, like we're talking about, the 1500s, 1600s, 1700s. And the kings and monarchies started centralizing their power. They started taking power off their upper classes and making sure it all funneled through a centralized kind of bureaucracy, a central system of management, giving ultimate and absolute power to those monarchs. So this original idea of revolution was actually about the actual term itself, coming full circle and going back to your point of origin. So the aristocrats, the nobles, the upper or the richer commoners, they wanted their power back of kings. It had nothing to do with, changing some type of social order and liberating mankind and all these lovely notions for equality and fraternity and all that sort of stuff. It was just about a bunch of, let's just be blunt here, pissed off aristocrats and people that were unhappy that kings had just started taking up all this power for themselves, and they wanted to go back to simpler times when they had more power. And so that's where the actual word and the phrase revolution comes from. It actually comes from its term and its meaning in astrology. It actually means to revolt and to come back to a point of origin. Yes, that's right. It's very contrary to what people think. Like the way that we use revolution today, politically, economically, socially, it's got to do with like changing the game, man, like and all that sort of stuff. Yeah, creating some form of equality for everyone. Yeah, sorry.
Why? Because the famous picture that I think of when I think of revolution is I don't know what painting it is, but it's men holding guns in their hands, and it's the famous French lady that's holding the French flag and looking off to the side. It's basically empowering the people. Like, but you're saying that's actually not the origin of the word at all.
Well, yeah, the derivation of the term has its meaning in astrology. Meaning they were actually like the idea of revolution originally was more aligned to conservatism than being progressive. If you think revolution today, you're thinking about some type of progress, social change, movement forward or away from, not going back to. Revolution was originally conservative. And that's where the term comes from. So if people are out there thinking, why is revolution, got this, it's such a straightforward word. Revolution, revolving door. It comes back to its point of origin all the time. It always is about coming back to something. But like that is completely far removed from its application in revolutionary theory and revolutionary politics. That's why it was a conservative notion at first. It was, hey, these kings have got too much power. Let's take it back from them and distribute that power amongst the people who should have it. The nobles, the aristocrats, people with power and esteem.
Right.
And nothing to do with leveling out societies and making them, more equal and more free. Had nothing to do with that originally. That's how it adapted in action. And that's where we start to form the modern meaning of the word revolution from a political, social aspect and from a perspective like that. So revolution, people often will tie to the idea of some type of violent takeover, right? I think we've talked about this sort of stuff before.
Yeah.
There's a strong association with revolution is like seizing the means by force and like taking over, bloodshed, military violence or violence of some form in order to overthrow an old power and institute a new one. And don't get me wrong, that's exactly the building blocks of a revolution. The revolution, in my mind, and from the research that I've been doing, is a lot more simpler than that, which is hard to disassociate from the whole, upheaval and death, destruction kind of thing. But it's really about social change. That's what a revolution comes down to. There's a social order in place, a hierarchy, an establishment.
Yeah. And
a revolution dismantles that previous social order and establishes a new one. Now, like we were talking about just a second ago, most people associate the revolution then with the physical takeover. So like when the Bolsheviks took power in the Russian Revolution, there was a fight. There was an all-out fight. When the bourgeois took over in the French Revolution, there was a physical fight. When the Americans got their independence from the English, there was a physical fight. There was a war.
Yeah.
These people were consumed by war, battles, bloodshed. And so people easily assume or they associate some type of warfare or battle or significant type of military victory with revolution. However, if revolution involves some type of military action, that might only be one of the steps, maybe the first step, but it's definitely not the whole picture.
Right.
Really, revolution doesn't have much to do with military aggression at all.
Well, yeah, because I guess there would be, if revolution was all about violence, then there would be no distinction between a coup and a revolution.
Yeah.
Because if it was all about fighting, then it would be exactly the same as me having an army and then just walking to the capital and saying, you know, hand over all that power, pretty please.
Yes, very good point. There's often this kind of link between a rebellion or a revolt and a coup, as you said,
Yeah.
like which is a military takeover, and a
Mm.
revolution. But those are not the same thing. They're not separate. They don't have to be completely separated. They're not mutually exclusive, but they are not one of the same. A military takeover can easily be done. A rebellion, a revolt can easily be done with someone who has a mightier force than the current establishment, comes in, overthrows their power, and maintains the same style of social order. If you have a king and another person who thinks they're king, and they come in and defeat the current one and keep the social order as a monarchy or some type of kingdom, that's not changing the social order. If you have an evil dictator and you have another dictator who thinks that they're better and they come in and take power in a military coup, that is not a change of social order. That is just a military takeover. And that is the important distinction. Revolutions aren't tied to military aggression. They're tied to the idea of revolutionizing the social order, changing the status quo, ridding the current establishment, and bringing about some new way of doing things, organizing society. So that is, I guess, the most important takeaway for the actual modern sense of revolution. It's about changing the social order.
No pun intended, but we'll just circle back just so I understand what you just said. The original take on revolution, or at least the original meaning, was almost like a jockeying of power. So you had different nobles fighting amongst each other, or you had different kings that were fighting amongst each other. And basically, that jockeying for power was the revolution, if you were. But then at some point, it suddenly turned into a class struggle, or it turned into an idea of, we want to change things for the better. And that's where our modern conception of what a revolution is. So, say, for example, we had a system such as monarchs that the nobles were the ones that kept everything in order. And then suddenly you have something like the French Revolution, where people wanted, I guess, a more egalitarian society. So you had, I guess, you had somebody that represented the people that was saying to them, "Hey, let's grab the power so we can make life more equal." And then you get such thing as a capitalist society, or at least the starting of the forms of a capitalist society. But that changing of power from the monarchs to the capitalists, that's the more modern revolution idea.
That's the modern revolutionary idea now.
Yeah.
A change in social order. Like, so you're almost there with it. It's more, it's these things developed around the same time. So the idea of revolution was happening at the same time that we actually get the French and the American revolutions, around the same historic time period, because kings and monarchies around the Western world were starting to centralize their power and taking power off the upper classes that traditionally had held it. It was more evenly distributed amongst kings and nobles and aristocrats and all that sort of stuff. They started to break that down, the kings and the monarchs. They started to centralize their power and remove privileges or power and rule from their aristocrats. And so at that time, just before the American and French revolutions, you have these nobles, these aristocrats getting together and contemplating how to change this absolutism, this centralizing of power by kings, how to change that back to the system they had, a few hundred years ago. That was working just fine for them. They had all the power they needed. They only reported to kings when they really needed to, and they could basically rally the whole country together. So they really were in charge of themselves, and they didn't have to answer to anybody on a regular basis. But once the kings started centralizing their power and became absolute monarchs, they wanted it back. So they wanted to revolve and go back to where they were a few hundred years ago. So they brought forward this idea of revolution as a way to get back their old system of power. But little did they know that by spurring on, inspiring this idea of revolution, hey, let's have some change here, let's go back, the people that they inspired with this notion of, hey, let's stop these tyrannical kings from just taking power of everyone and arbitrarily holding people against their will and taxing us to high heaven.
Mm-hmm.
People were like, hey, why stop at just giving power back to the nobles? Why not make society a little bit more fair for everyone and get rid of this system of privilege? And then this idea of revolution at that point changed forever.
Well, really, the systems that we trust in nowadays, it's from the French Revolution that we get those systems, like the courts, the parliament. Everything is from the initial revolution.
That's right. Republicanism, like Americans were instrumental in that. The French developed it in a European sense kind of thing and brought that onto the world stage. The Americans trialed it. The French really put it into practice on the continent of Europe and made it something that was tangible for the rest of the Western world. So yes, at that point where you have this idea of revolution, which is just a bunch of conservatives really saying, hey, we want some more power back of our king, we're sick of this absolutism, it was then that gave the inspiration for people to be like, for people in societies to be like, hey, we want more. And that leads us very nicely into our next little dot point there, the Bourgeois Revolution. So this is where things get interesting.
Well, before we do that, I'm sure we've thrown around a lot of French words, and this is another French word that we probably should explain to the audience. Right. Like, what is bourgeois?
Right.
What's the bourgeoisie?
Okay. Well, look, Bourges or Bourg was a town, I believe, or a township. And so the bourgeois were townspeople, and specifically rich townsfolk. So they were usually merchants and traders, people that were able to develop some level of power from their wealth accumulation, from trading, or a business, or being entrepreneurs, basically. And so this was developing around the same time as you was leading into the age of revolutions, when you start to have the American Revolution and the French Revolution, and then all the revolutions on continental Europe, and then spreading out throughout all the colonies of the world. You have these these rich people that start to, for the first time, realize that if they have property, if they are able to own things, they are able to take power for themselves. The only thing that's standing in their way at that point is a system of class privilege. So what I mean by that is, like, if you're born into the nobility or as an aristocrat or a king, then you have a God-given birthright to be in that class of people, and you sit above the majority of the world's population. You're just a better person by birthright. And it's these people, the bourgeois, these townspeople, who started accumulating wealth and seeing the power that it gave them, but still not being able to use it because it could be taken away from them at any point, especially the more you get a kind of centralized and absolute tyrant or king at the head of the nation or the head of the country, they started to think for themselves, hey, I'm making all this money here. I've got all this wealth, and with it, the power that it brings, but I still don't have that backing from society. It can all be taken away from me just like that. I could work, a few generations, or I could work my whole life to establish this little bourgeois empire here, this rich townfolk kind of way of life, and it could all be just taken from under me by the ruling of some king somewhere else. That's not fair. So these people, the bourgeois, who are known as the bourgeoisie, it's kind of interchangeable. These are the people that ended up taking this idea of revolution and selling it to the masses. This is where we start to have the American Revolution and the French Revolution.
Right. Okay. Yeah. Well, really, the French had a very close relationship with the Americans anyway, so it kind of makes sense. That timeline is kind of matching up, really.
Yeah, the differences between the American and French Revolution are very interesting, and like we could spend hours just talking about the different circumstances under which they both formed. Because the American Revolution was, on the back of great prosperity, in the sense that it was the new world. And when I say prosperity, I mean, obviously they were destroying the civilization that were there already, and the people that were there already, but like they treated it as basically a blank slate, and they just took over everything on that continent without any existing forces or establishment that was going to hold them back, like you would have in Europe. So the American Revolution was built on this idea of prosperity. They had all this wealth and they had all this land that people were able to take for themselves. And then the English were like, well, we're going to raise taxes. We want to claim some of this back. You can't just all be gallivanting around the new world and just doing what you want. We're going to rein you in here a little bit. And the Americans were like, hell no, you can't do that to me. How about you go and take this? And so they fought back. They revolted, or they rebelled against their colonial powers, and they won. And then they started to revolutionize their culture. The French, on the hand, there was this sentiment, this feeling in Europe at the time that the poor masses, or let's just call them the unprivileged masses of society, because this actually includes these bourgeois at this point. These unprivileged, whether they're rich or poor, members of society are unhappy that you have these nobility, the aristocrats and the kings, the monarchs sitting above them. They call all the shots. The clergy, as well, can't forget about the church, sitting above them, calling all the shots, and it's just not working anymore. People are poor and they're miserable, they're dying, and they're being taxed the hell out of. And they might have things taken away from them, they might be held against their will. All these sort of basic human rights that we have today, they start questioning them at this point. And the bourgeois, they piggyback this. They're like, okay, people are upset, people want change. And there's bourgeois in America, don't get me wrong. It's riddled with these kind of entrepreneurs and these people that have come across from the old world, like Europe, and made a name for themselves. But they're doing it on a different basis. The Americans are doing it because they've had a taste of what it really is to be free and prosperous, and they're not going to share it with the English. But the French, it comes from this idealistic sense of, hey, this is an opportunity here to have and set up some type of social structure which might allow us to be free and have some more of the fruits of society, not just have it all channeled to a absolute monarch.
It's actually got me thinking, because we're obviously talking about the idea of a bourgeois revolution, but a lot of people, like a term that people would much more know is the idea of the Industrial Revolution.
Mm.
Um, is there a little bit of nuance there? Is there a difference between the Bourgeois Revolution and the Industrial Revolution? Are they one and the same thing, or did one lead to the next? Like,
Very good question.
yeah.
Now, they are obviously inextricable. You can't untie the bourgeois revolution from the industrial revolution. You don't have an industrial revolution without the bourgeois, and we've chatted about this on a number of occasions, and it's very, very interesting. But yes, the bourgeois revolution sets the building blocks. So, like what we were talking about before, let's take the French example here. The bourgeois, the townspeople, they've got their wealth, they've got their power, but it can be taken away from them. And they want to establish a society that in which you have rights as a free person, and you can't have things taken away from you arbitrarily. If you build yourself a little empire, you've built yourself some wealth, you've gotten yourself some property, you can't have that taken away from you. And so the bourgeois have these ideals, which we've talked about in a couple of previous episodes now, these liberal ideals. They, on the back of the ideas of liberalism, they establish a society in France which tries to take on liberalism. Life, liberty, property. These are the three cornerstones of a liberal society. You throw in, obviously, so life, it's the right to live. So you don't have someone like a tyrant or an absolute ruler who can decide who lives and dies.
Yes.
Basically. So liberty is you have freedom to actually enjoy life and pursue whatever you believe will bring you the most enjoyment. But you can do that without unreasonable restraint. So as long as you're not being unreasonable and constraining somebody else, you are free to live the life that you choose. And then, you can debate about whether there's more cornerstones here, but let's just call property one of the cornerstones of that liberal world. And this is where the bourgeois have really had the most impact. They've come in and they have built their wealth. And they are sick of having it questioned or being taken away from them. So they put in this idea of private property, which we've also discussed. Yes. And private property is a thing that allows them, backed by society,
yes,
to own and accumulate wealth and power.
Capital.
Which will then form the basis for capital, which, like you're asking, is the backbone of the Industrial Revolution. So in terms of technological revolutions, they're different. There's a social revolution, which is what we're talking about here today. Technological revolutions are much different. You have agricultural revolution, which, changed man from a nomadic creature into a static creature who, lives off the land and cultivates the land to their advantage and stuff like that. Then you have the Industrial Revolution with particular technological advancements that just change the game and make society so much more productive that it's able to support so much more life. And it's be able to flourish and then produce more and more technology and the ever expanding and potentially even exponential rate. So these technological revolutions, yes, they kind of, they kind of ride or piggyback with these social revolutions. Also, you could say these social revolutions piggyback with these technological revolutions. They kind of rely on one another, but they're important events historically for humanity that just change the game. So if anything, they're both, yes, game-changing elements. One is purely social in terms of how society is organized, like your class divisions and your distinctions that you were talking about before. Technological, obviously, is something that it enables humanity to be able to provide for itself in a way in which it's never been able to do before.
So in a way, I guess you can view the bourgeoisie revolution and the industrial revolution as an interchangeable term. But I guess my understanding of what you were talking about is almost as if the bourgeoisie revolution is the ideology that's behind the revolution, whereas the industrial revolution is just referring to the actual fact of that technology being founded. So the bourgeoisie revolution is the idea of being free, not having like a divine right of kings above you, and like you having that capital, you having that technology, and being able to use it as a free person, as a free man. But the industrial revolution was actually like, sure, you had the peasantry, or you had people in agriculture that were working the land, but it was the update to that technology where you went into the cities, you went into, and there was that creation of the factories, and there was that mass production of products, of commodities, and that new technology changed the game. And that's what the Industrial Revolution was based on, because those free men that suddenly had the capital to create those factories and put those workers to work is what changed the game and created the Industrial Revolution.
Yes, the bourgeois were able to use the ideals of a liberal society, allowing a free person with free will to be able to accumulate enough property and have that property secured by the system for long enough for them to be able to turn it into something productive, or more productive than there had been in a time where it was not secure.
Yes.
Without that security of the state, of society, to say, no, this is yours, you can have this, do what you want with it if you obtain it legally and by right, then they are able to accumulate that and use that as a building block to change technology forever. Yes. Because they're able to sit on things and advance them in their own interests, with their own skills, with their own knowledge, their own passion, their own desires, as opposed to being always dictated to by some divine body or some person who really only got their power because of their birthright, through no merits of their own. And so the liberal system helps, I use this word loosely, helps kind of establish a society based on the meritocracy. And so those bourgeoisie values, those bourgeois values of meritocracy, is then transferred into the technological realm, because people start to develop things. They start to use their imagination because they can put some capital behind it, they can put some money behind it, and they can drive change. They can start to accumulate and pour money into massive industry. So for the first time, manufacturing isn't just done on an artisan level, like little people sitting around, making fancy clothes because they're just amazingly skilled at making clothes. No, they're developing things in a production line because somebody has accumulated enough wealth to hire or build a warehouse and accumulate enough raw material to have that raw material labored on by a series of workers, instead of one artisan who's skilled enough to do all the parts of making a shirt. You have a bunch of laborers who the labor is divided up amongst all of them, and they start producing goods. And that's how you have your industrial revolution on the back of the bourgeois social revolution. So yes, they're inextricable, but they're not the same thing. But you definitely don't have one without the other. And let's just call it how it is. The bourgeois revolution definitely came first. This was something that was working in the background for a long time. Like when the French Revolution kicked off, because people always kind of associate the French Revolution with 1789, storming the Bastille, bang, that's the date the revolution happened. If you look at what was going on before that, like the king had called an Estates General. He had called all of the different levels of society, the aristocracy, the clergy, and the third estate, who were unprivileged people but like kind of the rich representatives of the poor, of the commoners, the massive commoners, and had called these bourgeois in to kind of decide what they were going to do moving forward. They were bankrupt after the American Revolution and they needed a way forward. So he called upon everyone. And the bourgeois came with these little pieces of paper from all of their communities all over France. And they went out into their towns and they asked the people, they said, what do you want to see change? We'll take it to the king and we'll fight for your right. So the bourgeois was so important. Like if you talk to leftists today, Marxists today, whoever, they are highly critical of the bourgeois. Highly critical of the bourgeois that, they're evil capitalists and they've destroyed the world and they've done all these bad things. But like if you trace it back to their real origin, they were absolutely instrumental. They liberalized the world and they rallied the masses of people and fought for them, fought for their rights originally.
Well, to be honest, that first instance that you were just talking about, that sounded to me like representing the people, like representational democracy.
In a sense, yeah. They were, if we can use this word, like kind of delegates of the people. That obviously, let's be honest here, the bourgeois, because of their wealth, they were educated. Most of these people we're talking about here are lawyers. Okay, so they're townspeople. They're in a profession. They've got a legal background, and they've come from money. So like you don't just send, like if you're sending people from a town, you don't just send anyone. You'll be sending someone who's versed in the law, or who's is at least learned. So you send these bourgeois off, but like I was saying, they're not just representing the learned class, the academics, or the wealth from their town. Right. They still asked people, what do you want to see differently? We will talk to the king, we'll talk to the aristocracy, we will bring forward your notions and your ideas. Right. And they had these kind of good intentions.
Well, I think this is a good opportunity to kind of probably wind the clock forward, because we've talked about bourgeoisie revolution, but often Russia, they had a different idea of revolution. And it's probably a good opportunity to talk about Lenin Trotsky, because I've actually been reading his book recently, which talks about his ideas on permanent revolution. I guess to those of the audience that don't know, Trotsky, I guess in the main party in Russia around the time, around 1905 and 1917, when these revolutions were happening, one of the major parties that was happening at the time was the party that was behind Vladimir Lenin. And what Trotsky was, is he was kind of, along with probably a name that everyone recognizes, Stalin, probably for all the wrong reasons, but Stalin and Trotsky were basically the right-hand men of Lenin. And the reason why revolution happened in Russia was, well, it goes back to what you were saying before about a majority of a population not being educated, and you needed those kind of lawyers or those educated people in order to basically speak for the people. And the first half of the book actually discusses Lenin's ideas and also Trotsky's ideas, because Lenin Trotsky was actually a major tactician, and he was a major component to Lenin achieving that revolution. And what he talks about in the first half of the book is the idea of a vanguard party. And what a vanguard party is what I was talking about before. You have the educated people. Throughout Russia, there was a huge component of peasantry, people who were not educated. And what Lenin Trotsky thought was really important was, well, not only do you in order to get that revolution started, you needed those educated people to lead the peasantry, lead the proletariat into the revolutionary state.
So at this point in Russia, we're saying here they haven't gone through a bourgeois revolution.
No. That I think that's the reason why I was focusing more on the peasantry, as in they were like before the revolution, they were probably still in feudalistic times, because if I'm not mistaken, a czar was still in power. Yes. And well, they needed to kickstart that revolutionary process. And the vanguard party, as far as Lenin, Trotsky, and Stalin was concerned, they were the educated people that needed to lead the people into creating that revolution.
So in order to have a revolution, or a successful revolution, a change in a social order, you need to have kind of this driving force, this centralized kind of unit of knowledge and experience that kind of leads the way, drives it forward.
Correct.
Interesting. Okay.
So that's basically the first half of the book, where he talks about, hey, this is the ideas of what we were thinking about at the time. This is where we got to now. But this is also where things get interesting, because Lenin was obviously the boss, but his two right-hand men had completely different views on things. I think Trotsky was actually writing this later in time when he was actually in exile. But I think at the time, well, the time period that he's reflecting on, Trotsky believed in the global revolution policy. So basically, where they were at the time, the vanguard parties in power, what is the next stage of revolution? And Stalin was all in favor of the one country policy. Now, I'll explain those two policies now. So that concept believes in a two-stage revolution.
Which one? The global one we're talking about?
No. This is just like the two-stage revolution is just what Russia did.
Okay.
Period in terms of their revolution. So the two-stage revolution was you had a bourgeoisie, you had capitalists in a society basically build up the technology in a society. So, they were aware of, the English and how they had basically created their capital. They're aware of Germany and how they created their capital. But they obviously needed to get to that sort of similar technology. So they were all for, hey, bring in the educated people, bring in those capitalists, and learn from them, learn about that technology, and build up that industry. Basically, take advantage of the Industrial Revolution. But this is where the second stage comes in, and this is basically that butting of heads that Stalin and Trotsky came into. And that butting of heads was how you transfer power from the bourgeoisie or the capitalists to your fellow socialists, your fellow people. So basically giving power to the people. So what Stalin, Trotsky's opponent, thought was, well, we've got the proletariat here. We've got the people that are working the factories and all of that. We should give power to the proletariat, those workers, and basically keep the socialist state or the socialist revolution within one country, hence the one country policy. However, Trotsky took the complete opposite view of, well, we're kind of surrounded by capitalist societies, and, well, we're talking about a completely new power structure. those capitalist societies are going to see us as a threat and going to shut us down. So what he was all for was the global revolution policy. So not only starting off your revolution in your home country, in this case Russia, but then adapting your revolution to different countries and basically changing the socialist revolution, the second stage of your two-stage revolution, to suit each country. And that's the reason why in the second half of the book he makes it very clear to not only focus on the proletariat, those who are working the factories, but also to focus on the peasantry. So, because that's the reason why we have the Chinese revolutions that happened, which were much more focused on your peasantry compared to Russia, that was much more focused on the proletariat. So he was much more being flexible and not just ending with Russia, not just ending with your home country, but also being in solidarity with other countries and creating a socialist revolution where not only the proletariat is getting power, but the peasantry and other, I guess, working class factions, if you will.
Right. So just for the clarity of people that are listening, the proletariat, very particular word,
yes,
means the people of society, the section of the working class that specifically works in capitalist industry.
yes,
They're the industrial workers of the world. That is the proletariat. And I believe yes, sorry.
I guess all I was going to say is that they were basically the cause and effect of capitalists creating that industry, creating the technology of the factories. They were the ones that were working the factories and learned those skills.
Right. And so as people that were directly associated with the bourgeois, with the capitalists themselves, they were the ones, the proletariat, which were most appropriate in revolutionary theory to lead a social revolution, because they were right in there being affected directly by capitalists and being used as laborers, as cogs in a capitalist machine. And so they were the ones that would be inspired to create some form of social revolution, because they were at the coalface on the pub. They were literally there dealing with capitalists and the misery of the Industrial Revolution. And so they were the people that were going to be like, no, enough's enough, let's have some revolution here, as opposed to the peasantry, who were still people living off the land and hadn't been, let's say, tarnished or lived through some of the horror of industrialized society, because they were separated from it physically.
Yes.
But the proletariat is specific and special because they are the ones that know what it's like to have to deal with capitalist and bourgeois culture, and they want to liberate themselves from it.
Yes. And also, this kind of grounded approach kind of makes sense when you actually look into the background of Trotsky himself, because this was the man that was very much, he had a linking to the Soviets, which was basically the Council of Workers that basically Lenin gained a lot of his support for. If it wasn't for Trotsky and also his, I guess his tactics of, hey, we should take the utilities, we should take, the trains, we should take the factories, so we actually have the resources in order to make the revolution work. If he didn't get the backing of Trotsky, who had the ear of the Soviets, the councils, the revolution wouldn't have happened to begin with.
Right. And so these Soviets then are the embodiment of proletariat action.
Yes.
So when the proletariat get together and unionize and, in a bit of solidarity, work together to demand things off the capitalists, off the bourgeois, off the people that are running the show, so they can get better benefits, better working days, better conditions, all that sort of stuff. They form these kind of councils and these bodies. these kind of democratic bodies
Yes.
within the existing system in Russia.
Yeah, I think that's the reason why it all comes together, that you have the vanguard party, you have the educated, that, well, I guess you could view it as
So they're the
in,
specialized revolutionaries, right?
yeah, I guess you could say that it was there was like a bit of a benevolent framing of it, because the vanguard party was, the educated that were going to lead the way, and then those benevolent vanguard party would then pass the power to the then uh, empowered and educated proletariat. Would basically, it's a pass the parcel in terms of power. You have the vanguard to the proletariat to the peasantry. So one is basically empowering the next.
Yes.
And that's where the stance of at least the centralized systems of socialist society starts. Like
right.
it's around the Russian revolutions that you start getting those ideas.
Okay, so that idea of the state or the authoritarian communism, where
Yes.
you have that centralized body, centralized bureaucracy, all that sort of stuff that, coordinates this large organ, this socialist communist organ, and makes sure they're all driving in the same direction.
Yeah.
Leading society. Instead of a bourgeois class or a capitalist class, we're just leading society based on the next best economic decision.
But also, I guess what's interesting about Trotsky's idea is it's a interesting what if, because Stalin and Trotsky were butting heads about this idea of getting to the second stage of socialism. Well, history dictates who the winner was, which was Stalin.
Right.
And he obviously went with his idea, which was the one country policy. But I guess the criticisms that Trotsky had of the one country policy, well, they actually ended up happening. Capitalist societies, going back to America, they basically would oppose socialist societies, and eventually your socialist society would collapse because the common enemy would converge on you and turn on you, and eventually you would collapse, which basically ended up happening to the USSR.
Right.
But it's an interesting what if of, if, say, for example, Stalin lost out and Trotsky was the successor to Lenin. His global revolution policies, if for whatever reason he decided to, back
the permanent revolution.
Well, yeah, not only that, but say he decided to invest in, Vietnam, if he decided to invest in a more benevolent North Korea. I don't know, but in the alternate reality here, but if that sort of way of looking at things, it would be interesting to see what the world would be like, or at least what would history be like, if he actually decided to win that fight.
Yes, if you'd had the opportunity to take power.
Win that fight ideology.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's very interesting because, like, if you have a look at the works, of Marx and the internationals, and even Lenin, there is this idea that it's not just a nation by nation decision. Nations don't just voluntarily enter into socialism and just kind of stand alone and things will develop in that way. There's this element and this pressing need for international solidarity and international organization. It's not, you can't, from these revolutionary socialist revolutionaries' perspectives, you don't beat capitalism by doing it in one place at a time. It has to happen. It has to spring up everywhere in order to be at least have a fighting chance. So it's interesting that, you know, Trotsky's taken that kind of approach on board, that international effort, as opposed to like, let's develop it here in our country first, make it strong, and then we could spread it out if we need to. Very interesting tactics, but like obviously all context driven. Like you're saying, like the Trotsky discussion is completely theoretical, where Stalin's choices were obviously based on his constraints and his context and about leading a country and the current adversaries that he had at the time when he was making his decisions.
Yeah, because I guess this is where we come into the criticism of Trotsky, is that his global revolution policy is not tested. And plus, because Stalin ideology-wise won the war with his one country policy, Trotsky, until his death, he basically was like an opposition leader. He from afar, he basically would say, "Oh, Stalin stuffed up with this. Stalin stuffed up with this. I don't really agree with that." But he had no real power.
Yeah.
And also a lot of people disagree with him actually setting up an international himself that people believe that divided the socialists and leftists in general even more, which a lot of people have a lot of problems with. But I still think it's worth investigating his ideas, though.
Yeah. Well, like, look, whether you call it Trotskyism or not, there's a very well-respected Marxist that, you know, most people, I think, or most leftists or most people would just agree on, is an important figure in history in terms of socialism, communism, is Che Guevara. And his ideas were definitely not just to keep the revolution in Cuba, but it was to spread the revolution throughout the whole of South America, to spread it in Africa and in Asia. His idea was, in fact, to use the third world, you know, whatever that means, and use that as the vehicle in which to battle the global domination of capitalism. Spread communism, or spread Marxist thought, spread these ideas, this ideology in these locations that weren't the drivers of capitalism. They were subject to them, don't get me wrong, but they weren't, I guess, the dominant world power, capitalist powers. And his idea was, okay, now we've done Cuba, what's next? It was not like, let's just stay in Cuba and make sure Cuba survives. So, like, you know, for all those people that are naysayers of Trotsky, you know, they probably quite admire Fidel and Che. And their ideals were, yes, let's spread this bad boy and let's set the world on fire, kind of thing. Let's keep going on this train.
Yeah,
you know, we could really change the world here. So very, very interesting theories on revolution, this idea of permanent revolution and the global socialist revolution. Very interesting.
Yeah. I guess with that, I think we were kind of discussing this before, but the section of what's that synthwave art, I think what we might do is in future we'll describe for the listeners of the podcast, and we'll also put up an image for those that are watching on YouTube. But we'll describe it to you. We'll let people guess as to what the art is in the comments. And because I really can't speak highly of this AI program, but for those of you that are listening, this week's synthwave art, you can see that there's a bunch of people in the foreground of the image, and I can see a red flag there with a rainbow sky and what looks to be a statue in the center. So have a quick look at that in the video, and we'll make sure to also link the image in the YouTube video as well, and give us an idea of what you think the prompt is.
Yes, for all those people that are watching and listening on YouTube, tell us what you think the prompt is in the comments, and we'll let you know in the next episode what the real prompt was. We'll see how close you can get.
Yes.
And so just one more thing before we wrap up today. 4eyes or 4IS, you have something very special in the works going on at the moment, don't you?
Yes. I guess you've inspired me, Mr. E, but I'm also doing my own, I guess, video essays. And I'm going to be focusing on at least ideas out of very specific revolutionary books. And I'm going to be focusing on political commentary, economic theory, and revolutionary thinking. And but I'm also going to be making sure to link it to concepts within our time, or at least relevant events. And the concept I'm doing right now is ScoMo and the social question. So I'm actually going into how 19th century liberals actually have influenced ScoMo's most punitive policies, which is in Australia the Inju card and robo-debt. And it's been a very interesting journey.
Interesting. So what we'll do is we'll put a link for the people on YouTube. We'll put a link in the description to 4IS's YouTube channel. Please make sure that you go there and subscribe, so when the video comes out, you can watch it firsthand.
Thank you, Mr. E, and thank you, everyone. I guess that's a wrap on this week's episode, and keep thinking and keep learning. Mr. E?
Thank you, 4IS. For all you people out there, please remember, I am, you are, we are a mystery.